it really just depends on what your priority is. If your priority as let's go down to that dining facility manager, if your priority as a dining facility manager to make sure you provide the best experience to the people that choose to eat there, then you may potentially operate in some gray areas. I've never seen a good dining facility manager not operate in some gray areas. I'll be point blank.
Okay, guys, welcome back to another week with Alex and Drew here at Mops and Mo's. This is a very exciting episode for me because longtime listeners will know the hill that I have chosen to die upon is the one currently occupied by AAFES, specific to just sort of military nutrition at large. And today we finally managed to track down somebody who can speak to that. But before we introduce the guest, we've got a little bit of a community shout out, Alex.
Yeah, this is a big one. Avid listeners will have listened to the KC episode talking about landing her anti-aircraft damaged A-10 Warthog. Pretty awesome story. That has led to our current shout out. This is to Mrs. Peacock's sixth grade math and science class at Sherwood Middle School in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. They were headed to the Krista McCullough Library for a simulation kind of learning experience that involved radio calls. And anybody who listened to Casey's episode knows that sounding good on the radio is absolutely the most important part of being a successful pilot, especially in a combat scenario like that. So they listened to the SR-71 Blackbird radio check story that we mentioned in that episode to prepare those middle schoolers for their simulation. So shout out Mrs. Peacock.
I will say for people that have not yet listened to that airspeed check, I mean, that's like a classic. It's been around forever. We mentioned it in Casey's episode. It's in the show notes there. You can also just Google ground speed check story and you will find it. But that has nothing to do with today's episode. Today's episode is all about military nutrition. And for that, now I will turn it back to you, Alex, to introduce our guest.
So our guest is Jeremy Deck. Currently, he is a vice president at the national insurance brokerage firm Hub International, specializing in commercial risk management, employee benefit, and human resources consulting. Although the bio he sent us focused heavily on his work in the insurance industry, that is obviously not what we are here to talk to him about. Jeremy is a retired chief warrant officer, and his professional career spanning over 2 decades in the Army all across from cook all the way up to running entire facilities, culminating as the food service director for the United States Military Academy at West Point. And it's that experience kind of behind the scenes, not on the policy end, but on the actual execution end of making Army food service happen that makes him the perfect person for us to bring on to discuss one of our favorite issues, especially one of Drew's favorite issues, how the Army feeds its soldiers. Jeremy has a passion for service to the community, is involved in several organizations locally, nonprofits, things like that. He volunteers as a mentor with American Corporate Partners, which places industry mentors with service members exploring post-military employment. So if you're looking to make a transition like he did, certainly hit him up. And additionally, his community involvement includes board service with the nonprofit Eating for Your Health, which is a Princeton, New Jersey-based nonprofit that aims to promote health through cooking and eating whole, nutrient-dense foods. Throwback to our Food is Medicine episode, they're making that work a reality. And those are just two examples of many that he is a part of. He has his MBA from the University of South Carolina's Darla Moore School of Business, specialized in international business, and he also has a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from UNC Pembroke. And an important shout out before we roll into the episode. You'll hear a couple times Jeremy mentioned during the episode that somebody connected us to him. And I do apologize for not having the name on hand while we were chatting with him, but this is our next shout out before we roll into the episode. George Daly, West Point class of 2019 and Ohio State Law class of 2025. So it sounds like he's soon to be a lawyer. He was the first one. He slid into the Instagram DMs, referred us to Jeremy. He knows we're always on the hunt for information about Army food stuff. And he had mentioned that Jeremy had an absolutely night and day impact on turning around the food service operation at West Point. So that's how this all came to be. Thanks, George.
Thank you, George. And yeah, I just want to say I'm excited. I'm real excited. We finally, I feel like we broke the seal feel like we found somebody who's willing to talk about Army nutrition, military nutrition, and hopefully this leads to some more hard-hitting episodes as we continue to pursue the question of why the hell are the food options for the American military so shitty. So with that, enjoy this week's episode.
In the lead up to this, I actually listened to a bunch of episodes. So not only have I listened to the Emma podcast from 6 months ago at this point. Well, so Emma, interesting story. Emma was a cadet while I was at West Point. So I will cautiously say I had a pretty big impact in doing a lot of things at West Point. And Emma will probably attest to that. I think I can't remember what year she graduated, but I believe she was a firstie the year I took over. I'd be shocked if the person that reached out to you to suggest me to come on your podcast was not one of the cadets that I had an opportunity to work with while I was there.
So I'm actually a little bit curious about that, having
Okay.
like been a cadet and eating at that mess hall all the time. How, in what capacity did cadets end up working directly with you? Like what was that role?
So I will give you the Cliff's Notes version. So I was working at Fort Jackson, a place I understand you're
Mhm.
pretty familiar with too. We did not overlap. I think I left
No.
either right before you got there. There was a little bit. I checked the years you were there on LinkedIn. I was
Nice.
stalking you. But we weren't there. I don't believe we were there at the same
Okay.
time. But long story short, I'm sitting at my desk in at Fort Jackson in September of 2017, and my brigade commander, who had AMC, Army Sustainment Command, Army Materiel Command oversight of pretty much every installation along the East Coast, reaches out to me and says, Jeremy, I have a problem at West Point. I need you to go fix it. And that was pretty much all he told me. So I show up and there's a bit of a toxic work environment there. The cadets don't like the food. The feedback mechanism isn't there. So when they have feedback about the food, they feel like it falls on deaf ears. I could go on and on. The list is long and pretty painful to relive. But within a short couple of months, I had gotten to a point where I worked myself into a job. AMCIG approached me, and this all came about because of like 4-star level attention over some issues and some pictures that had been forwarded to basically the wrong person.
Mhm.
But long story short, as I started working there, and AMC approached me about 3-4 months in and said, hey, would you like to take a PCS here? And that's how I got involved and how I got there permanently. And they have since replaced me with a warrant officer twice. I retired in 2020, and they replaced me in about 3 months after I retired with another warrant officer, and have since replaced that person. And he's been up there. So the guy's name is Jason Page. He's the guy that's up there now. And somebody, admittedly, you should probably connect with, because he does a lot with, he is very familiar with H2F, I'm sure. And he's done a lot of things up at West Point since he's been there.
Can you, to sort of, I guess, lay the foundation here,
Yeah.
or set the tone, if you will. Can you talk about some of the biggest things that about Army food policy that folks either don't know or don't understand? Like to me, especially as a civilian,
Yeah.
it's very foreign.
So I will start so I guess I'll say that Army food policy, you guys hit the nail on the head when you were talking to Rob in a lot of ways. You literally pulled the regulation, it sounds like, and said the U.S. Army is the executive agent for DoD food service for the most part. I can't remember if that's exactly how you quoted it, but you hit the nail right on the head. Army food policy is managed from what used to be Fort Lee, Virginia, and now it's Fort Greg Adams, if I remember correctly. The whole names thing is a little hard to get to make the
Drew
switch in
knows.
my brain.
Drew works at
I'm
Fort
at
Liberty.
Fort Liberty.
I was about to ask you which one of you is in the Carolinas. So I have two
That's-
kids from my first marriage, and they're in the Carolinas where you are right now.
Hell
So,
yeah. It's the best state ever. Anyway.
I was a Bragg guy, well, Liberty guy.
Liberty,
I guess.
yeah,
It
there you
doesn't
go.
have the same ring to it anymore. For about half my career, so I have a pretty long, distinguished career jumping out of airplanes.
Nice.
Yeah, but Army food policy was always grounded, I guess, in nutritional policy. So it was based in nutrition. There were minimum menu requirements, minimum requirements that had to be offered at every meal, variety, salad bars, the whole 9 yards. The challenge we used to always run into, two things. One is people are still going to make the choices they want to make. It's not like call it back in the day when you were going to basic training, you didn't march to the DFAC anymore. You had the choice to go. And when given the choice, there were people that chose to come to the DFAC and people that didn't. The DFAC is a business, and attracting people often means you have to get a little creative. And the other point I wanted to make here is a lot of it is predicated on people. The ability to, I'll call it what it is, talent. If you don't have somebody that knows how to cook or actually cares about how to cook, you're going to have an operation that suffers. You're going to have a DFAC that's substandard. Or I can't remember who made the point. I think it was Alex. If your commander comes into the dining facility to eat, you're probably going to have a good dining facility. There's some truth to that, because you obviously have to exert a little bit of care when you know the man or the commander is coming in to eat. It's just the way it works. I mean, when you talk to Rob about the blanking on the GAO report, there was a lot of things in that episode that completely resonated with me as a brand new private. Talking to a captain was a very, very difficult thing, much less giving him negative feedback, because you don't want to tell anybody that outranks you or give them any type of negative feedback whatsoever. And later in my career, I think the dynamic changed over the years. I think it's slightly different though. I think that transparency and that call it horizontal communication across commands has certainly gotten, or across rank structures, I guess I should say, has gotten a lot better over the years. But what I will say is I think the overwhelming urge is to, at a lower level company, lower battalion, maybe platoon, is when you have somebody that outranks you come into your footprint, your area, you always want to put on a good show. And that is universal across the military. I don't think there's anybody that's going to not try to put on a good show and whitewash things that are probably not going to be so good when the commander shows up.
So I got you called DFACs a business, and you have your MBA now, right? You're working like the business world and everything. Yeah. I have a question about like the core of the business model, which is soldiers who live in the barracks get money deducted from their pay. They're authorized BAS, but that BAS never goes into their account. It goes to pay for the food theoretically. That's but right. then the DFAC only receives that money if the soldier uses their meal card at the DFAC. That is my like vague understanding of how that money is controlled, right? Like their head count is what drives funding for the DFAC. Where does the rest of the BAS go?
So it's a little bit, so you're kind of sort of from a...
yeah, I'm sure it's more complicated than that.
An overarching view, that's essentially how it works. However, what you don't know is that in most cases, so each Army installation, military installation, receives a certain amount of money per meal to prepare. And this is actually going to be one of the points and one of the rabbit holes, I guess, I was going to go down during this conversation, was a lot of that is not only a talent and people and all those other things, but money has a big role in it. And when you slice the BAS into a per meal or even a per day basis, in most cases, the math actually works out in more in favor of the dining facility than it does the soldier. So I don't know what the latest numbers are. I could probably look really quickly, but each military installation has what's called a basic daily food allowance. I don't know if they've changed the acronym since I retired, but it's essentially the amount of money it costs that installation to bring food to every dining facility in the installation. So on a per person basis, the basic daily food allowance works out to a way to, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? It's essentially a zero sum for the cost it takes to ship food to this location versus what it costs to prepare a meal for that soldier. And to the best of the dining facility's ability, they're supposed to be at or near zero. So the cost it takes to deliver and provide food for the masses versus the number of people they actually feed should equal close to zero. So it's like operating a nonprofit at an individual dining facility level at every dining facility across the Army. Does that make sense?
It starts to make sense, but there's like so many potential rabbit holes that come off of it of like
I guarantee that amount of money is probably less than it would cost the soldier to eat at the various AFES installations around the DFAC. And so the DFACs have to produce food at like a harder price to compete with. And there's so many layers of conversations that become
Say
challenging.
that point one more time, please.
So I would have to look up the numbers to check this 100%. But if a soldier decided to eat 3 meals a day at the food court at the PX, that's probably going to cost them more dollars than the DFAC gets to provide the meals it's trying to compete with those installations for.
Correct.
So immediately, the DFACs are at a disadvantage. And granted, the DFACs don't have to make a profit, so maybe it works out a little bit better. But the DFACs are at a slight financial disadvantage to try and compete with the other installations on the DFAC that are trying to serve food to soldiers at a profit.
I would say that's 100% accurate in the way you broke it down. And to that point is, think about this. When you go into an Army DFAC, you have to think about offering a wide variety to cater to a wide audience. Whereas you go into Pizza Hut, you're going to get a pizza and some wings. You go into, I'll use an example, Chipotle, you're going to go in and get a rice bowl with some meat and some veggies and all these other things. And at the end of the day, the dining facility has to provide probably 3 to 4 times the variety that a fast casual place like Chick-fil-A, or I'm sorry, not Chick-fil-A, Chipotle has to provide. So the cost delta is pretty wide, I would say.
So I'm looking up, I had to pull up the numbers just because I was curious about it. And the numbers do vary based on location and things like that. But the CONUS average is $18.24 per day, not per meal, per day.
Per day.
It's $18.24
per soldier.
So Drew, your soldiers at Fort Liberty, they appear to be under a Cisco contract or something, but it is $17.56 per day.
That's how much the Army spends in food per soldier.
In theory, when you drill it down into the individual soldier level, yes.
Is there a way, I don't know where this is going to take us, but I'm curious about it. Because I'm thinking of this from a human performance standpoint, right? And one of the things that we've sort of teased, I think, talking about some of the VA stuff, everybody has this kind of hypothetical reality where could you incentivize soldiers financially to be healthier versus to be, less healthy and claim 100% disability, yada, yada, yada. $17 a day per soldier for arguably 3 meals seems like incredibly cheap, for lack of a better term.
Believe it or not, that sounds like a lot to me, because when I retired 4 years ago, I want to say the number was 13.
Oh, I'm sure it's gone up. Yeah.
So it's gone up.
I'm sure it's gone up.
There's been some pretty large inflationary pressures on the BDFA over the last 4 or 5 years.
I wonder if you could because that there's money being sunk into ABCP related issues and injuries related to overweight and obesity. Could you somehow divert some savings from programs designed to target that to increase that $17 amount so that you could compete with the Qdobas and the whatevers? I don't know. I don't know if any of us are qualified to answer that question, but it just comes
so believe
to
it or
mind.
not, we actually give now. Obviously, it's a very small subset of the military in general, and I can only speak from the Army perspective, but I can imagine the other services do something similar. But there's a supplemental allowance for special forces. I want to say when I was in SOF, it was 15% on top of that BDFA. So it wasn't huge, but it was certainly very impactful in that extra $1.70 or $1.75 makes a big difference.
I'll trigger people with this, but is that a blatant admission that subset of people deserves a better quality of food?
I mean, yes.
Because
that has elicited a lot of I should say, a lot of discussion in my active Army days when I was on both sides of SOF and non-SOF, and there was always this perception that they get better stuff.
It's like people first, but really it's like some people first.
I'll push this in a slightly different direction with 2 separate points. And one is, as the Army tries to implement H2F, they're basically saying they're trying to copy a human performance model that was piloted in special operations. And if you want the results that a program like that gets, you probably need all the pieces of that program. And one of the pieces is an increase in how much you spend on food. The other piece of it is, you said it's roughly 15%, or it was at the time you retired or you were in SOF and things like that. And I'll say I've eaten in a lot of DFACs, conventional and SOF. And the SOF DFACs aren't 15% better. they're like 50 or 100% better. There's
I
like a
was gonna
noticeable
say.
difference in performance. So it clearly is more than just the BDFA that contributes to the outcomes experienced in terms of food quality and just nutrition and the overall experience. So that kind of brings us back to the talent management side of the whole thing and the culture
Yep.
and the commander investment and all that. So it's money's definitely a huge part of this, but it's not the only piece that determines the outcomes.
That's true.
There wasn't really a question there. Sorry.
I
No, good.
no, this is I've wanted to ask this question for so long. I think you might be the guy, so thank you.
I'll try.
Does APHIS undermine the efforts of the DFAC to create a healthy nutrition environment for our soldiers?
I had a feeling you were going to go there.
It's
And
the
I
hill
was
I want to die
prepared.
on, and I think this is I'm finally there.
I was prepared with an answer, and Alex, this one might actually resonate with you really, really well. So, in my roughly year and a half to 2 years at Fort Jackson before I ended up going to West Point, I made it my mission to figure out a way to give parents that would come to basic training graduation at Fort Jackson an insight as to what a day in the life of a basic trainee might look like. One of those things was a trip to the DFAC to enjoy a meal with your graduating basic trainee. And I approached the garrison commander, and don't get me lying to you, I'm not going to tell you a name because I don't remember it anyway. But the garrison commander basically told me point blank, that's never going to happen. And he didn't use these words, so I'm going to be completely. He was very tactful in the delivery, but he basically said that's not going to happen because the parents and the basic trainees, when they go to Burger King and use the installation facilities, help fund the.
This is exactly what the problem is.
Help fund the other programs on the installation. And I was going to be very non-politically correct in my answer, but I'll keep it.
Wait,
So
wait,
I'm going to break down two things. I'm going to unpack it, Drew. I promise.
Please. Yeah,
because
please.
there's deep stuff here. And one, I'm trying to dig through my email for the FOIA results I got to figure out the date on this one. It was like only 1 to 2 years ago when the Army Inspector General realized that APHIS played a part in the food environment on our installations.
Yep.
First off, just shocking. Like it came up in the FOIA I did was to try and get the meeting minutes from the board of directors for APHIS, which
Freedom of Information Act for people who don't know what he's saying.
Yeah, we're getting nerdy here, but I think it's
loves
important.
a FOIA. Loves a FOIA.
Drew says I love a FOIA. I had one successful FOIA ever.
Loves a FOIA.
And it turned out I happened to FOIA. Like nobody else is interested in FOIAing APHIS. I've had friends try to like send FOIAs to like the Pentagon, and it's like a 4-year wait and stuff like that. But I think it's important because the board of directors for APHIS are almost all uniformed senior leaders. There's a bunch of 3 stars and a bunch of senior nominative sergeant majors and things like that. A couple of senior civilians. So like it is uniform people making some of these decisions, and they weren't even considering their influence on the food environment for our service members until within the last 18 to 24 months.
Which is mind-boggling.
But then
it's a little mind-blowing. And keep in mind too that APHIS actually franchises all of the operations you see. The Burger Kings you see on most Army installations, those are franchised directly to APHIS.
Yeah. And then the other piece of what Jeremy was saying is that when people spend money at those locations, they fund family morale, welfare, and recreation events because APHIS dividend goes into funding category B and C MWR activities. And we're getting into like the policy nonsense that nobody else cares about. And I just like sit up at night reading weird regulations and stuff because I'm a nerd. But like MWR, like non-appropriated fund activities, they have 4 or 3 categories, A, B, and C. A are fully funded. Like they have decided that these activities are necessary for like readiness, right? So I think gyms are fully funded. Gyms don't have to like get money from other sources to work. Category B are like partially funded, and category C are self-sustaining. Like they can make a profit on their own and succeed. And for example, childcare is category B. So we've decided that childcare is not important enough to readiness that we should fully fund it, and it's going to have to make up some of its money by billing service members and the rest of its money from APHIS dividend type of things or fundraisers or whatever they do. Part of that is because childcare is usually a paid for service, and we shouldn't it shouldn't cost everybody for a thing that only certain people use, whatever. There's some logic, that's fine. But my argument would be, and I've said this before, it's very tongue in cheek, it's very cynical and sarcastic, but maybe we should consider a model where the quality of childcare our families in the military receive is not dependent on how much money they spend on alcohol, firearms, and fast food. Maybe we should consider that.
Could you, Jeremy, you might know the answer to this. Like, could you do that same dividend model through the DFAC? Could you set that minimum threshold for that $17 and any money earned above that per meal gets shuttled towards the MWR type stuff versus pulling from AFES?
For profit defects.
Yeah.
It's two different pots of money.
Well, yeah, but
Yeah.
that's a pencil flip or a pencil flick at some level, isn't it?
I wish.
Colors of money stuff gets hard.
Colors of money, yeah, crossing colors of money is a huge no-no.
It's actually the one of the core reasons H2F had to be implemented at an Army-wide level rather than installation level.
But is that a path dependency difficulty, or is that like we created that? Surely we could.
Congress created that. It's law stuff. And the challenge here, so I'll use it like I've been at a bunch of installations where division commanders cared about human performance and invested in it out of their own money. And the idea is human performance saves money in terms of costs of medical care and things like that. But medical care doesn't come out of a division commander's budget, and the human performance, like whatever program they institute, does come out of the division commander's budget. So he is not rewarded for the savings. He's only punished for the cost. And it comes back to what Jeremy said about different colors of money, and you can't get them to play together. And yes, that's a stupid answer because it means there is clearly a solution. You just have to get a law passed, but getting laws passed is hard.
I mean, it goes back to, I think in the lead up to this, you would ask me about my level of comfort with doing the podcast in the first place. And I think I was concerned about, has Army food service policy changed in the 4 years since I retired? And much to my dismay, I went and checked that the regulation hasn't actually been updated since 2019. So I would say I still have what would be considered relevant knowledge specific to documented food service doctrine. However, I mean, kind of pivoting to some of the questions you brought up in the email you sent me earlier is kiosks. So kiosks have been kind of that conversation that has been happening for quite a number of years. And I would say that I'm going to give them a plug that they rightly deserve. So Army Food Service has been doing a phenomenal job with what they have. And I think some of my colleagues out there will agree with me that we make it work with what we got. Sometimes we may be faced with some manning shortages like you clearly alluded to. And shoot, when I came in the Army, my first assignment as a cook, excuse me, I'll be politically correct, a food service specialist. Back in the early days of then Fort Bragg, I was with the 325th Airborne Infantry Regiment, and I worked nonstop 14, 15-hour days for probably my first 2 months. Almost straight. It felt like almost straight as a brand new private, fresh out of school. I barely knew what time off was. And the occasional weekend I got was certainly relished. And I feel like based on some of the conversations I've had that's a lot of the same struggle that's happening right now. As I came in 1996 when we were faced with a lot of the same recruitment struggles.
Is it true? So like obviously some DFACs are staffed with uniformed cooks and some DFACs are contracted out. Is it true that the only like actual staffed mission for the cooks is field feeding and deployment feeding, and that DFAC operations are kind of like this extra garrison function that comes on top of their existing training and mission requirements? Because I keep hearing that when they talk about closing DFACs for deployments and whatever other competing requirements, but
a lot more complicated than that. But yeah, I mean, you're on the I guess on the right track. So Army organizations, and I probably can say that most military organizations are staffed to support the mission that they ultimately are expected to perform in combat.
Yeah.
And in this case, an Army organization is staffed with the number of 92 Golfs that it takes to perform a mission in a combat environment. That's the book answer in all likelihood. I mean, I haven't necessarily checked Army doctrine in terms of manning lately. But I think you could tie back the mission attributable to a type of combat related mission in some way. in a garrison environment, I alluded to this a couple minutes ago, there's a lot of variety. And the way especially combat units or staff, you just don't have the ability to support a garrison mission to the degree that garrison missions have become. My first assignment was at a battalion-sized dining facility that fed 250 people, roughly 3 meals a day, and we had a battalion of about 500. In those days, everybody, I would say a good part of the organization, ate in the defect. Times have changed. Deployments have changed. I think one of the biggest struggles I had while I was a warrant officer in food service was trying to convince command teams that cooks belonged in the dining facility. I mean, that's in the GAO report, you mentioned that there was acknowledgement that first sergeants and commanders are powerless. Well, the one thing they can control is whether their cooks are actually working in a defect. That's a struggle I had, or in a fight I had all the time. And not to go too far into that rabbit hole, but I get there's exceptions. But if you're a commander and a first sergeant and you're saying you're powerless to affect the defect, you should probably look to see how many 92 Golfs are actually working outside of the defect first. And that happens a lot more than you might think.
I mean, I know several of them that are definitely not working in a defect. So
now
I
will say, so I mentioned things have changed. So I actually belong to a Facebook group of nothing but Army food service professionals. I'm still a part of the group. And I was made aware through that group that the Quartermaster General, I believe, has implemented a certain approach to make combat feeding and field feeding a priority mission for 92 Golfs. Meaning it sounds like the move, and this is just me talking and sharing an opinion at this point, is to likely move in the direction where the Marines went X number, I think decades ago at this point, in that the field and combat mission is meant to be the primary mission, and the garrison operation should be saved for likely civilians. I don't necessarily know what the behind the scenes are there, but based on what I saw, it seems like the direction the Army is trying to go is a more combat and field focus with 92 Golfs.
Do you happen to know, my sample size is all anecdotal. I've been to like several dozen defects at this point, so it's like a pretty good sampling, but it's still limited.
Yeah.
It seemed like, in my experience, contracted defects seemed to run a little bit more smoothly, and I'm guessing that's because they didn't have to like uproot and go do a different mission and then set back up again. Is that a general trend that contracted defects are a smoother operation, or is that just what I've randomly happened to bump into?
No, I think there's generally a perception that civilian run facilities run smoother. And I think that's more a function of the fact that they staff appropriately, to be completely frank with you. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was in I was a brand new warrant officer in Camp Taji, Iraq. The facility that I had contract oversight of was, I think, fed around 10,000 at lunchtime. And they had a small army, literally, of third country nationals preparing food. And the choices were phenomenal. I mean, you could go in and have steak and lobster, but at least once a month. And it was, I don't know what the staff was, but it was easily in the hundreds. I mean, heck, at West Point, I had a staff of 80 civilians to feed 4,000 cadets. And the staffing there, I felt was probably a little low, but contracted defects are more concerned about getting it right in certain ways and making sure they don't overload the staff than they are about. I guess the point I was trying to make was that they're more concerned about making sure they have the appropriate workload and workflows rather than making sure they have numbers to support a field mission, if that makes any sense.
This is not where I was planning to go with it, but I am just mildly curious about it as someone who was on the receiving end of like West Point's food service.
I picture Hogwarts. Does it look like that? Like the dining hall?
It's pretty Hogwartsy. It's
a
like
little bit.
I'll send you a YouTube video later. It's pretty Hogwartsy.
Kids in hats.
But that was the question I was going to come to, and this actually is also a thing at Hogwarts. But all of those meals are served simultaneously. It's not like any other operation where people come through a line and they like filter in over an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. Like having 80 people serve 4,000 people simultaneously is a pretty significant feat of just like choreography.
That was just the cooks.
Okay.
The contracted staff to actually do the feeding and take all the food out to the dining area was 130 or so.
That makes a little more
Roughly
sense.
a staff of about, when you add in the contractors, it was a staff of over 200
Okay. Those
for
numbers make a little,
4,500 cadets.
yeah. Dang. Drew, I'll send you a video because it's a pretty neat. There's like a time lapse video out there that shows it happening. It's pretty neat.
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Of cadets eating in
20
wizard
minutes.
hats.
Not the wizard hats part, but
Oh,
eating.
it's too
And
bad.
yeah.
Interesting. I was curious to see how you tied Hogwarts dining in with West Point dining. So that was well played.
Well, they get as close as they can. Like Hogwarts, obviously, the food just like floats up from the basement onto the tables because magic.
Is that
they-
not what West Point does? Because
they're not quite
how y'all
there.
carry yourselves that you're getting floating food. You go to the academy? Oh, me too. I went to the academy. What house were you in?
Drew
Oh,
talks a lot of shit for somebody where like a quarter of our podcast guests are from the academy.
yeah, I know.
I was about to say, I was distinctly noticing the academy, I guess, love, for lack of a better term.
I'm just
on
always
Rob's
outnumbered.
episode.
I'm always outnumbered when we have
I
academy.
know who I know. Sorry, it's not my fault.
Fine, go Tar Heels.
Look,
Um,
I actually really enjoyed my time at West Point, and I will call it what it is. I drank the Kool-Aid, having never really had much of a perception of West Point at all, other than dealing with the repercussions when they come out to the service. I being there was pretty awesome, an awesome experience for a guy who started as an enlisted guy, became a warrant officer, and then I'm only one of only like 3 warrant officers on the entire academy grounds. And it was cool to be able to work with cadets during my time there. In fact, that was probably one of the most rewarding time in my career was the last 3 years, and getting to get a chance to mentor cadets and educate them on what a warrant officer is and does before they come out to the force as lieutenants was a pretty awesome thing for me. In fact, I will say that having and getting a chance to teach cadets and mentor cadets in the way that I was able to, really allowed it just most commissioned officers don't really deal with warrant officers a lot until they get to become senior, like majors and lieutenant colonels, and it was nice to be able to deliver that type of impact before they even join the force.
Well, that raises 2 questions for me.
Sure.
The first one's fast, the second one's long. Fast one is, you said 3 warrant officers in the installation. So one is you.
Yep.
The second one is the superintendent's pilot. Who's the third one?
Actually, well, so I wasn't counting the pilots.
Okay.
So fair enough. Well, but the pilots don't actually work on West Point. They actually work at the airport about 20 minutes north.
Sure.
So it was me, the paralegal, and the strength manager, I believe.
Okay.
There was
That
a strength
tracks.
manager in S1. There was a paralegal warrant officer in obviously the legal section. Oh, and the band guy.
Yep.
There was a
Yeah.
band warrant too. So
The
4.
band guy.
The band
Okay.
guy. There was a band warrant.
Fair enough. And then the longer question is, what was the forum that gave you the opportunity to do that mentoring? What was that? Who were the cadets? Like, how did that all work out?
So as part of my, I guess, call it marketing tour to help fix the food service, the mess hall at West Point, I actually learned pretty early that cadet feedback was a problem. And as some of the cadets that are probably listening to this now will clearly remember, I actually created a private Facebook group for all the cadets to be a part of, to share their feedback. And one of the things we did was use cadets as a way to, Drew, for your knowledge, when you go to West Point, you're expected to, or any of the service academies for that matter, there's an engineering requirement. So regardless of whether you're, Alex, did you take an engineering class too?
I was a systems engineer track guy. Everybody
See?
sticks some kind of track regardless of the
Exactly.
major.
So I utilized a lot of the systems engineering classes for a lot of my case study learning. So I actually approached some of the faculty in the engineering department and said, hey, I have
Nice.
something I'd like to work with you on. Can you help me? So they'd assign a team of cadets that would show up, and I would try to do at least one systems engineering case study project every semester, whether that was minimizing waste or helping with the flow of the serving area at lunchtime when it was most challenging. I would approach the engineering department with a lot of different asks.
That's awesome. Okay. Now I kind of wish I was part of that. I think I ended up doing a system engineering project on like gym stuff, being me, but I want to go back to one we talked about at the top, because you said you spent time doing soft side food service and
Yep.
conventional side food service. And we kind of briefly touched on some of the advantages they have and things like that. But what is it about how they operate that produces such like noticeably better outcomes? And how the add-on to that is what can like conventional defects learn from some of those? Because like a lot of those defects are on bases that are primarily conventional, right?
Yep.
Like Campbell, you've got a soft defect and you've got tons of conventional. Liberty, you've got soft and tons of conventional. Like all these places, more, yeah. So
I,
like,
I, I think
why
it's
is
a
there not more
combination of a
exchange of
lot.
knowledge? Yeah,
I think but I don't necessarily know that it's knowledge. I think it's just the tangibles. It's the talent. It's the
sure.
money. It's the fact that there's a little bit extra care involved in certain respects. I mean, it's a lot of things. I've seen great food service specialists at installations. I've seen horrible ones. I've seen great, or like I'll give a shout out to Fort Gordon. So I had some regional oversight of Fort Gordon while I was at Fort Jackson, and I would say I've run across a lot of Army food service contractors in the day, and the company that had Fort Gordon was phenomenal. Like they went out of their way to make and ensure a great experience for, mainly in that case, AIT soldiers. But I don't even know if they're calling it AIT anymore. But it was a pretty phenomenal contractor, and they did a great job of just making sure that the choice was there, the quality was there. And that's the thing we haven't really talked about, was quality really has a lot to do with that. From a business standpoint,
We'll get there. Don't
yeah.
worry.
From a business standpoint, quality is everything. You talked about good defects and bad defects on the episode with Rob, and it speaks to the ability for, I think the Michelin restaurants were discussed during Rob's episodes too. And I've worked for a lot of great defects in the day. I worked for a lot of great leaders. And I think it really always comes down to that other point that we haven't talked about, is management and leadership of the individual dining facility itself. I worked for some great dining facility managers in the day.
So I know Drew has a question, but since you just did a shout out for Fort Gordon, I want to shout out specifically 316 Cav at Fort Moore, formerly Benning.
Oh,
I don't know what they're doing there, and I forget if it was
Hopefully
Wednesday or
flying
Thursday.
helicopters.
I mean, they do a lot of things, but I think it's primarily armor and like reconnaissance training stuff. But that DFAC was doing something special. The surf and turf day they had was, what we said, the average CONUS is like $18 per day. I had like a steak and a bunch of lobster and a bowl of fresh blueberries and like a bunch of other things. And like people came out of the woodwork to go to that DFAC. There were a bunch of soft guys eating there. There were a bunch of civilians eating there. The like ratio of lieutenant colonels that like you never see those guys eat at DFACs, and they were all there. Like it can be done. I don't know what was happening there. Maybe they had like extra budget they needed to spend on food or something. I have no idea, but 316 Cav.
I have my I did Army food service for a very long time, and I was an enlisted guy for half of that. And I will say there's a predominant theme in most of the good facilities I worked at. And that predominant theme was ensure quality at all costs. And I will leave it at that without going into too much detail.
I want to take you there. Who ensures quality?
I say ensuring quality is a very politically correct way of saying there may have been some rules broken along the way to make sure that the reputation and the food quality and the diner experience was not hindered by certain things.
And by certain things, you mean
Okay,
laws
I'm gonna hold your hand. We're gonna go down this. Wait, say that again. I was talking when you talked. That sounded important.
I said by certain things he means laws and policies. They were entering the gray area to achieve quality.
There were some gray areas.
But does that not speak to?
Oh, it most certainly does.
It should be. So, what forum would that be discussed in? Like, hey guys, no shit. Laws and policies are getting in the way of what? Because I say that sitting in the seat of hearing senior leaders talk about, insert whatever warrior restaurant. Like, they have these visions for these defects. And from what you guys just talked about with that CAV unit, like that's what that vision is. And they want to do it. They want to get there. And what I'm hearing you say is in order to get there, you have to like quote unquote break these rules, which arguably means that you could come up with a list of those rules that we could then hand to those senior leaders that they could then break to then achieve that vision. But that's not happening. Why?
Because some people will always operate in the black and white and refuse to go into the gray. And there's nothing wrong with it. Like if you live in the black and white, there's nothing wrong. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what I am saying is if it really just depends on what your priority is. If your priority as let's go down to that dining facility manager, if your priority is a dining facility manager to make sure you provide the best experience to the people that choose to eat there, then you may potentially operate in some gray areas. I've never seen a good dining facility manager not operate in some gray areas. I'll be point blank.
Can I ask a dumb question? And
Sure.
you can refuse to answer this.
No such thing.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot because we're talking about gray areas. And when I'm thinking quality gray area, I'm picturing some dining facility dude like smuggling in local chicken.
Oh no.
Like, so what do you mean when you're talking about
happen.
when you're talking about gray areas when it comes to food service? Like what is that gray area?
It's just ways to increase the amount of money you get for every meal and every soldier.
So it does come back to a financial.
Oh yeah, it sure does. It's I mean I've long made the argument, especially in my warrant officer days, where I felt like I had a little bit of rank to throw around, and
yeah, sure,
it didn't really work. It was just a matter of arguing for. I mean, I'll give you two perspectives, right? So, you mentioned the roughly average $18 figure across the Army. In 2020, when I left West Point, the average cadet BDFA, basic daily food allowance for those folks that are acronymically challenged. I'm trying to spit that out. Was 24. The difference between the two, mind you, is that if you're a cadet at West Point, you pay for your own food through basically what amounts to a payroll deduction.
Yep.
You fund your own food when you go to West Point?
Isn't that what BAS is though?
In a less direct way.
So no. Yeah. I mean, it gets a little complicated, but to a degree, yes.
Well, this is a weird question. Is it partly because West Point hasn't been able to get away with institutionalizing some of the gray area stuff you're talking about? Like because they're a DRU, meaning like they're a direct report to Department of the Army, and they don't have to go through a whole bunch of different channels for things. Can they just get away with more and like institute policies that work better?
I mean, they can get sponsored by Gatorade and Nike.
Well,
the athletics department is a separate nonprofit.
I know.
Relax.
So that's exactly that's kind of where I was going to take it, but
don't even get into how the athletes are fed.
Yeah, but not necessarily the same. So because of the way food is funded at West Point, it's a non-appropriated fund.
Actually, that brings up a fantastic question. So, Jeremy, you would know this answer more than anybody. So there are heavy tables at West Point, meaning like certain sports get fed twice as much food.
Correct.
But
we wasted most of it, just putting it out.
I believe that. But how is that sorted out? Given that everybody has the same payroll deduction, how do they make the numbers work to feed certain people more food?
Economies of scale.
Okay, fair.
Yeah, that's exactly why.
I want to go back to these gray areas with you. Because I've long
you
said
definitely want to die on that hill.
I do, and I will be the first to raise my hand and say this is we've arrived at the hill. I feel very good about this. You and I have arrived at this hill together. We talked about this daily food allowance, $18 number. Do you know, or is there a corresponding number that AFES has that they spend per day trying to feed soldiers?
Oh, it's just profit motivated, man. They adjust to the demand.
There's a certain degree of profit involved there. You're absolutely
because
right.
People don't like to debate with me because I try to simplify everything. And what I'm hearing happen right now is that there's a profit-driven franchise model churning its way through military installations, being driven by senior leaders, targeting soldiers as an end user, trying to make money to then fund otherwise unfundable resources on base that we quote unquote can't afford unless they buy alcohol and energy drinks. Meanwhile, we have other senior leaders pushing really hard to fund and resource programs, trying to drive down obesity, drive down musculoskeletal injuries, increase soldier access at these DFACs. Like, why, why is that happening? I can't wrap my head around that.
That's a really, really complicated that I don't even know if I want to begin to peel back that onion.
Oh, well, then let me rephrase the
Yeah.
question. Can that change? Or are we just sitting here
Oh,
talking in
absolutely.
circles at these conferences?
It absolutely. I mean, I do feel it can certainly change, but I mean, I think it's funny that you had some of this same discussion with the Sergeant Major of the Army, or excuse me, former Sergeant Major of the Army, and I mean, I think he talked about choice a lot, and
Yeah,
I
I
would
don't
say
buy
it's
that. No disrespect to
yeah,
him. I just don't buy it. I'm like, okay, fair. But like, if I'm getting home from the field at the ass hours of the morning and the DFAC's not open, I don't have much choice.
but okay, so I would agree with you, but in the same vein, it's when you force a basic trainee to spend 8 weeks in basic training, and the first thing they do is run to Burger King when you give them the opportunity. It's not necessarily about choice; it's about comfort.
So I
True.
think this opens the door for a brief psychology rant I wanted to insert into this episode. And you talked about comfort. Comfort is a huge factor. And
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure you're aware that part of how the Army plans meals is
yep,
based on comfort. Like
yep.
that's literally a doctrinal part of the whole process is to make people feel comfortable in uncomfortable environments. But another one that we've circled around a lot is we've talked about quality here a ton with the built-in assumption that people choose food based on like some kind of rational actor model, quality per dollar kind of thing. And like enough research has been done that we can pretty conclusively say they don't do that. Some people do. There's a subset of people that will like prioritize quality and nutrition over price and things like that. Got it. But the vast majority of people seem to choose primarily based on predictability. And I think that's where some of our challenges come in with the DFAC is you can walk in the DFAC on any given day and you don't know what's going to be there. And you don't know how good it's going to be or if your favorite item or whatever.
Yep,
Lots of things disrupt predictability in the DFAC.
yep.
If I go to Qdoba or Panda Express or McDonald's or Burger King, I know exactly what is going to be there. I know exactly how it's going to taste. There is no variation.
Yes.
And unfortunately, humans seek out predictability for the sake of comfort as their primary decision factor. Even if they don't think they're doing it, it is influencing their choices deeply.
Purely anecdotal, but just drop this that my wife will not go to a local coffee shop because
Well,
it does not produce anything that remotely resembles the quality and
Mhm.
predictability of Starbucks.
oh my God.
No, I will say like I was just in Hawaii last week. Hawaii grows a lot of coffee locally. They have a lot of awesome coffee companies, and Starbucks has a chokehold on those islands. There is a Starbucks every like 200 yards if you're in tourist
You
areas.
know, that sounds like AFI's having a chokehold on the military food environment.
I mean,
Jeremy, what would happen if tomorrow I don't know who would make this decision, the president eliminated all fast food from military installations? Like, truthfully, what would happen? Would DFACs take off because that was our only choice? Or would we all starve to death?
I think that all run off base.
Even the ones that don't have like the ability to do that?
they would find it. They get
Yeah, I was
up
about
it.
to
I
Yeah.
say,
think so.
I mean, and that was admittedly the biggest thing we struggled with. We admittedly, I don't know how many other installations you've been to, Drew, and I don't know how consistently Alex you get around, but um, our biggest, I guess, call it challenge wasn't necessarily always AFEs. It was restaurants in close proximity to the installation at lunchtime. It was, hey, we're going to have a going away or a farewell for Sergeant so and so. Let's go to the local Chinese buffet.
Mhm.
It's that choice, and admittedly, there's always a subset of soldiers you could always count on to see in the DFAC, 3 meals a day, 7 days
Mhm.
a week if you were open on the weekends. But there were also that share that just wanted change. They wanted that they didn't want to deal with the dining facility lines at lunch, or they didn't necessarily, and admittedly, yes, when you go into a DFAC, there were usually a lot of lines in the quote unquote short order area. But there were equally people eating from the regular food area where you would get a starch a protein, a vegetable, a cooked vegetable, you would go to the salad bar. And I would say there were a large share of people, especially in the run and better run facilities that had more choices in those specific instances. But I think our biggest competitor wasn't necessarily always AFES. It was those off-base establishments that you could go to, the Olive Gardens and the pizza joints and the Chinese buffets. And admittedly, those are I think those were our bigger competition rather than just AFES. So I think I guess I want to caution you. You talk about AFES a lot, but I think AFES is only partially to blame in terms of that specific issue. I think off-base establishments do the same thing or have the same impact. And if you take AFES away and you take away the ability for them to offer choices like that on the installation, they're just going to gravitate off base to those bases where it's in close proximity. Fort Liberty being a good example of that. I mean, you drive out what used to be the Yadkin Gate, and Yadkin Road was riddled with a whole bunch of little small restaurants where you could go in, grab a meal, fast casual, I guess is the best way to put it. Grab a meal, be in and out in 30, 45 minutes.
So if you change, though, that profit model that we talked about, where it's funding MWR type stuff, like if you just eliminate that, does that level the playing field?
I think that change would get commanders to be suddenly more motivated to make their defects good. Because right now, if a commander makes their defect good and more people eat the defect and stop going to AFES, the commander just loses money straight up. They lose money for family morale welfare programs. So it would change commanders' incentive structure.
I mean, that seems like an easy thing. Why is that not?
I mean, you're starting to mess with big dollar value amounts of money changing hands, and you got to talk to people at a higher level than us.
No, yeah.
And let's be real about the way a dining facility on an installation operates. There's no money changing hands at all. It's essentially like a checking account.
Mm-hmm.
Meals prepared versus meals consumed. That's it. As long as it equals 0 at the end of the year, that's the judge of whether you've performed well or not.
Yeah, I don't fully understand. I've talked to plenty of dietitians who will have the conversation about defects being underspent or overspent and how they like zero out by the end of the year. That's a game I don't totally understand that I'm not even sure we have time to go into here.
It's that checking account, basically. It's meals consumed versus meals prepared, or dollar amount associated with both, I should say.
So should people expect nicer meals towards the end of the fiscal year and defects that are accidentally underspent or something like you said?
Maybe.
That's when commanders start buying made knives. And
I think that's the gray area we talked about.
Yeah. Interesting.
Somewhat.
Anyway.
Somewhat. I mean, I've worked in many an operation that tries to start the year in what I'll call and what you've heard referred to as an underspent status, and then you put yourself in a position where you can incrementally make improvements throughout the year.
The economical gymnastics of the DFAC.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to say you got to have a degree in accounting, but in some ways, look, financial accounting was easy for me in college because I knew exactly how it worked.
All right. So we're getting close to the hour mark here.
Yeah.
I'm going to drag us towards like a couple, hopefully productive, brief discussions. And then we're going to do some rapid fire closers.
Yeah.
As a relatively quick, productive one, something we've seen a ton of in the years since you retired is H2F brigade dietitians working through DFACs and through food service warrants to institute things like meal prep programs or trying to improve the meals and the DFACs and things like that. What should a dietitian, like especially a new dietitian who's like going through school right now and about to get launched out into the Army, what should they know to help make those partnerships successful? Like from the food service warrant side, from the accounting side, what should a dietitian who just wants to make healthier meals more accessible to soldiers know about how to work with you?
Teamwork, communication, and flexibility are the easiest things I can say. I mean, I think it's all a conversation. And I would say a lot of that is education. I think that comparison is kind of reminds me of the first platoon leader you get as a platoon sergeant, and you want to take them under your wing to make sure they're successful. But as the lieutenant, you're always at least maybe a little leery of maybe getting bogus information or even being put in a position where you have to make a hard choice and I guess call it pick sides. So I think it's communication. It's part communication, part education, and a whole lot of teamwork.
Fair enough. And a lot of making decisions about whether you are a black and white person or a gray area person.
Fair enough. Yes.
Okay,
I think there's
deal.
some of that involved too.
All right. My other one is purely kind of a perceptions based thing. I mentioned before, I've eaten at dozens of DFACs. During my time as a lieutenant and a captain, I ate functionally every breakfast that I wasn't in the field at the DFAC, and certainly not as many lunches and very few dinners, because I was usually home for dinner if I was in garrison and things like that. But in my experience, having eaten however many hundreds or thousands of DFAC meals, one, I had mostly good experiences, and two, I can't even remember a time where I ran into the classic portion size issue where people like soldiers are talking about not getting enough portions or not getting two proteins or whatever, things like that. It seems like those issues, if I was an outside observer just looking at social media and like Reddit and things like that, it would seem like DFACs are constantly serving undercooked stuff or portions that are too small or terrible food or whatever it is. Are we struggling also from like the classic phenomenon of like it it takes like 5 times as many good meals to get a good review as it does to take a bad review in a restaurant? Like, are we just suffering from that phenomenon? Because it seems like DFACs probably perform better than the public perception makes it out to be.
I mean, that's a very, very good way of pointing it out. So I think there's some probably a lot of truth to what you just said. And I will say, I mean, I listened to, full disclosure, I listened to Rob's episode like 6 times
Yeah.
because I wanted to make sure I came on tonight and actually had something to talk about.
I mean, I don't know if you're already in touch with, but like you and Rob should probably collaborate on some stuff. I feel like there's a
Well, that's
partnership.
awesome. I appreciate that. But in the build up for this, I listened to it multiple times, and I feel like you're right. That's a big part of the phenomenon. I feel like the bad news is going to get highlighted more than the good news. And with my West Point experience, especially, it's like, look, when I took over, I knew the food service staff was doing good things. I knew the leadership at the cadet mess hall was doing good things. It was just a matter of getting the right attention to the good things and shifting the focus from only bad to highlighting the good, especially when it happened, because it wasn't highlighted before. So there's probably a lot of truth to that. I mean, let's use Google reviews as a good example. Most people, if they have an axe to grind, are going to go to Google to post something. Whereas if you've had a great experience, you're less likely to do that. And there's business education and business surveys out there to reinforce that point across academia. Like I've seen and been involved in a lot of academic survey work and research that suggests that if you have something bad to say, you're more likely to say it than if you have something good to say. And to that point, I think Rob talked about raw chicken in a couple of instances, and I'm certainly not going to make excuses. There's
Sashimi, chicken,
no place.
chicken
Yeah.
sashimi.
There's no place for raw chicken. I mean, call it what it is, but I'm not going to make excuses, but it happens. And the reason you don't go into a restaurant and see raw chicken is because in a lot of instances you either get a pre-cooked product where you don't have to worry about it, but who in the interest of making sure you get call it close to home or as close to a home, I'll call it a home cooked meal as possible, the less you process something. And this goes to the Dr. Muzaffarian episode to a degree, is dining facilities are largely meant to prepare food from close to scratch. And that includes raw ingredients. You go to AFES, I promise you, AFES is not getting raw chicken, or in most cases, they're not getting raw chicken. And they don't necessarily have to be as mindful of food safety as a dining facility does. And it's really that balance is, do you want to make sure you don't get raw chicken? Or do you want to make sure you get wholesome food that is minimally processed? And layer those two perspectives in with management, talent, money, and all of those other things that impact a dining facility. And what you're left with is pick a side.
Yeah. Now do it for $18 a day.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Well, this teed up my question perfectly, because this is one that I really wanted to ask. The current food policy, is it the best that it could possibly be given the constraints that we've been talking about, or is it the worst that we're willing to tolerate?
I think at the, I mean, having, okay, so having led a bunch of people a bunch of soldiers and a bunch of civilians in food service establishments across the Army, and now being an individual performer in an organization of 18,000 employees like I am today, I will say when at the big Army level, instituting that kind of standardization across a force of 400 and I guess 480,000 people, not including the National Guard and the reserves, is extremely tough. I mean, you don't even, you have dining facilities that can't even meet the minimum standard now, let alone trying to incite and require a higher standard. So I guess the methodology is that the Army mandates a certain requirement, and then at the installation level, those installations require other, I guess, call it standards of operation. They don't necessarily mandate the menu specifically, but they certainly manage and mandate things like quality. They perform quality assurance evaluations across both civilian and military dining facilities. It really just depends on what level of standardization you want to implement at what level.
So how
And I
do
think that's the challenge. I think that's the challenge is what level of standardization do you want at each level if you want standardization at all?
huh. I was going to ask, like, given that, how do you quality control being done at the micro level, then how do you have facilities failing?
I think you touched on this a little bit, the feedback mechanism. The feedback mechanism is the issue.
Okay.
You talked about ICE during Rob's episode. You talked about holding contractors accountable over a month after a picture surfaces. You can't do that. It's next to impossible. You have to fix the feedback mechanism.
That's an easy one.
Well, you would think.
Theoretically.
Yeah, not so easy.
Yeah.
So let me ask
Easy in
you,
theory, hard in practice.
I know Alex, I'll give Alex the closer, because he's got one that's close to the heart, but I do want to ask the question that we so frequently ask our guests, which is that if you had the keys to the castle for Army food policy, what would it look like?
I thought about this one because I was hoping this question was going to come too.
Well, there you go. On a platter, on a silver platter. In a DFAC, I'm handing you this question.
My food service brethren are probably going to hate me for this comment if it ever surfaces.
Good.
But what I will say is just give everybody a separate ration. Everybody gets BAS, and
Woo!
it's up to them to figure it out.
All the soldiers love you right now.
So you're saying, explain that to a civilian. Explain that in
Actually,
NFL terms.
but before he explains it, I want to ask a clarifying question because
Sure.
the base I currently work on has just submitted a recommendation to do that for the installation.
Yep.
But what I know is that it was a recommendation from the installation commander up to somebody above the installation.
Yep.
Where is the decision authority for granting BAS, BAS2, whatever it is?
So at the micro level, it's the company commander. A company commander at any installation, at least it used to be. I don't know if they've changed
But
that.
clearly an installation commander can't do it for the whole installation in one fell swoop.
Right.
So where's that decision? Or is that just bureaucratic stuff that's deeper in the weeds?
My guess is Army G1. That would be my fundamental understanding. Well, real or potentially Army G8.
Sure.
Because it involves money.
Yeah.
Well, so now explain what you just said.
Sure. So if you generally, if you live off base, you get what is called BAS, basic allowance for subsistence. You get a certain set amount of money every month to pay for your own subsistence, food. Whether you choose to go to the commissary or eat at Burger King is irrelevant. You can go eat what you want, where you want, when you want, and the Army is going to give you a set amount of money every month to do that. And if you run out, then you better figure it out. The argument has long been, well, what happens if you have a private that burns through their paycheck and their separate rations? What do you do then? Do they go hungry? In this model, they just might. I mean, I guess it forces you to be a little responsible as a private, in one vein. I guess in the other part, but the other part to that is, and this is the part why I actually went down this road instead of another road, was because one of the big long-running discussions while I was in for a long time at this point was that if you're on separate rations and you go to the field,
I was hoping you were going to say this.
yeah, you're supposed to recoup. So an army organization is supposed to recover separate
Yep.
rations for
Yeah,
every
meal deductions happen
meal
for everybody
deduction.
that goes to the field because the Army is
Correct.
feeding you during that time. Yes.
There was a study a couple of years ago. I can't remember what the dollar amount is. It was either in the millions or billions with a B. I can't remember. But there was a significant, the study concluded there was a significant amount of money being consumed at no cost by people collecting separate rations.
Yeah. And I believe that because like having been, like as a platoon leader, it was just me filling out an Excel spreadsheet and sending it off to like the XO who sent it off to whoever S4 to like make sure those meal deductions were done. And I'm sure some sort of inspection happened, but like how do you really, when like you have squads and platoons going to the field on and off all the time throughout an entire training cycle, I'm sure there's missed spreadsheets that go on in that. So
I was in my 12 years as a warrant officer and the numerous field training exercises that I went on, I think I had my separate rations recovered one time.
Cool.
Once.
that's because you're a warrant officer. Nobody was tracking you on their spreadsheets.
So is the fix that easy though? Just give BAS back to the soldiers?
I mean, I think so to a degree. I think you have to figure out what that scenario looks like, how to address the private with no money.
So I
If
have,
you can do that, I think that fixes a lot of them.
I feel
I'm not
like
gonna
that
say it
has to
fixes
have been
the problem.
addressed. I feel like that has to have been addressed because there are privates at installations that don't have defects. There are privates in remote locations. I know like before I came to Colorado, I was working at Fort Eustis, which does have defects, but some of those units had guys out at Fort Story, and Fort Story
No,
does not have a
I
defect. So
know
those
that
guys,
place kind of well. I've been there
yeah.
before too.
So those guys get BAS too, right?
Yeah.
To include junior soldiers, right?
Yep.
What happened to them at the end of the month?
They figure it out.
That's what I'm saying. Like
Yeah.
we have case studies that people have navigated this successfully.
Yep.
I don't know. Whatever.
I mean, let's call it what it is. Eating and making sure you have enough to survive is a fundamental part of human
Yeah.
of life. You know what I mean? So
Is this a
I
hard
think
is this a hard decision for senior leaders to make because it means surrendering profit?
profit in what way?
I think it just comes back to that whole AFES generates money for, but like, if anything, so actually, no. I think
Yeah,
the
I
answer
don't
to
think
Drew's
so.
question is no, because if you give them all BAS or BAS2,
They could go
depending on
wherever they want.
their kitchenette situation,
Yeah.
all that is like potentially more money that flows into MWR. Yeah.
It's like true competition at that point.
Yes. It becomes a fair competition between the DFAC and whoever.
So what you're
other
saying
vendors
is
out
we
there.
just solved the military's food issues.
We'll see.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily know that we've solved the nutrition issues.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Got him. So
That's true.
we're over on time, and I have an absolutely critical question that I have to ask you before we
Sure.
let you go.
Dude, this
why,
is fun. We can keep going if you want.
why is DFAC breakfast so good compared to other meals? Like, why is it so consistent?
Because you're half
can't-
asleep.
Wait,
can't get
you
a-
said it. You said it. I don't even have to answer anymore. You said it already.
You're half asleep. Your ratio.
No, it's consistent. It's the same meal every day.
Oh, he's probably right. But like, I cannot prepare that quantity and quality of food at the same cost at home. Not a chance, because they can operate at scale. I can't get that quantity and quality of food at a restaurant for a nearly comparable price. I'm paying triple if I go to a restaurant for sure. Like DFACs crush breakfast. Do we just need like more predictability in lunch and dinner meals?
I would say, depending on what facility you eat at, I think that predictability is there. I mean, the menu rotates. I mean, obviously, breakfast is, for the most part, the same every day, minus a few exceptions.
Interesting.
I think that predictability is there. The only thing that fluctuates is what's actually served at those meals. I think the predictability, I think I think that predictability exists, but you're not going to go in. If you go in wanting chicken and you see beef, you'll be disappointed. You know what I mean? But you can go into a DFAC breakfast every day and you're going to get bacon, sausage, gravy, biscuits, potatoes, hard boiled. You know what I mean? You're going to get you have those choices every day. You're going to get cut fruit. You're going to get cottage cheese. You're going to have cereal. You're going to have all of these. I think I mentioned all of these choices. But the one thing you're going to have with all those choices, it's the same choice. It's the multitude of choices every day.
Mhm.
Interesting.
There you go. All right. as someone who has said that this is the hill I'm going to die on, I'm happy to have finally gotten to this hill. So thank you so much for
Yeah.
coming on. And I don't think this will be the last time we speak to you. This has been a lot of fun.
What? Yeah, this is cool. I would certainly come back if given the opportunity. You guys are a blast, and I'm not sure which of my former cadets that recommended me, but if they reach out on social media in some way, I'll probably have laughed because part of me feels like it might have been Emma.
Maybe
I'm
so.
actually gonna have to go back and look. I would tell you right now if I had it, and I'll try and search it up before we close. But if not, it will be in either the intro or the outro, so we can give them credit for making this episode happen.
Boom. I'm finding myself equal parts enlightened and frustrated.
That tends to happen when you get too deep in the bureaucracy.
Well, it's just, I mean, we talked about this. Well, we keep talking about this hill we want to die on, specifically the one I want to die on, which is this exact topic, Army food policy and the war against APHIS. And to just confront the truth over and over again of like, it's because people want it to be this way that it is this way. It's like, it's so annoying.
It also brings to mind, and I don't want to get political on the podcast. This will be a nonpartisan political issue, though. It applies to all parties equally. Congress will like talk about caring about whatever's hot at the moment. Actually solving things is a whole different problem because a lot of these issues we're talking about, once we get into like big pots of money and feeding 500,000 people daily. So we talked about the $18 number in this episode, right? If you start to multiply it by 500,000 people a day, however many days a year they feed them, you can call it 365 or you can subtract leave days or whatever. You're talking about an absolutely massive amount of money. Solving money issues, like you hear all the time, don't look at what people say to determine what they actually prioritize, what they actually care about. Look at how they allocate their people and their money.
But to me, it's a top down versus a bottom up thing. So like
Sure.
top down, we can outfit like, and this is where I think the military industrial thing comes into play because top down as a military, America is far and away superior in terms of armaments, equipment, funding. But bottom up, like the people, like sounds so existential, but like the people are suffering. Like they get the last of the money. Like he mentioned it, like $15 million a day. Okay, seems like a lot. How much does an F-35 cost?
Sure.
Like one less F-35, you could improve. And I know it's not that easy. Like I get that this is all wishful thinking, but like I just get tired of sitting in these symposiums and conferences about people first and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, yeah, well, like you're
Well,
giving
I
away
think
free alcohol samples on Monday.
you're getting close to a topic because like you have your version of this hill to die on, and I care about a similar hill, but from a different perspective. And I think we might need to try and track down. And it'd be really hard to find one of these people who's willing to talk candidly about the issue is the problem. But we need somebody who can speak to DoD finance at a high level. Because what we bumped into a couple times in this conversation was the colors of money issue. Like feeding people better would reduce costs on the medical end and the disability end and the readiness end and a couple other places, right?
And it would increase performance.
It would. And since those are other people's, I'm not totally convinced they care about performance beyond just compliance and readiness, right? That's a whole separate conversation.
Sure.
But like commanders at a low level do, but bean counters at a high level, I don't know. Because like the Army doesn't, the people in the Army that are making H2F happen don't sell it by saying we're increasing performance. They sell it by saying, look at all these places where we're saving money, right? So I think that same conversation would have to happen on the food service side of, and I think I've talked to somebody, I can't remember who it is, somebody who's been in my DMs. Hopefully you listen to the podcast. Please slide back into the DMs. I know there's been some studies on like soldiers who eat more meals at the DFAC are less likely to be on ABCP. And I bet similar studies could be done of like soldiers who eat more meals at the DFAC. Like look at injury rates, look at diabetes diagnoses, look at all sorts of things. And like if you could go one step further from the original study, right? If soldiers who eat at the DFAC are X% less likely to be on ABCP, then look at long-term health outcomes for soldiers on ABCP, because I bet those people are more likely, we know they're more likely to get injured, more likely to get disabled, but you can also look at increased medical costs long-term for all of the downstream
things they're going to deal with. And that's how you have to articulate it to decision makers is, hey, if we spent X% more on how we feed our soldiers at our DFACs, we could save this much from these pots. And you, the guy who moves money between pots, can start making those decisions.
I'm with you. I just think it's hard when some of those people are also franchising Burger
Sure,
Kings on military installations.
probably. And I would also argue that there are a lot more guys in those positions who want to get a job with Raytheon or Lockheed than want to get a job with like a Cisco.
Yeah.
So they're not in the food game.
Yeah. And just to put a bow on this, because I know we do have conversations like these that seem somewhat apart from human performance. I think it, for me at least, this type of stuff, and we talk about colors of money, finance, food policy, like it all to me comes back to like creating the most optimal environment for the soldier to perform. So it seems, I think for some folks, it seems a far stretch from reps and sets, which is kind of the genesis of this podcast. But I don't, if you think about it, I don't really feel that it's as far away as a lot of people think that it is.
I'll potentially, I'm not sure I'm arguing with you as much as I'm arguing with the hypothetical person you're describing.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, people are more like we know our episodes about reps and sets get more downloads, and that's what people get hyped up on. But if you look at the research on what makes a difference in performance outcomes, the thing like Drew calls it performance peripherals, and it's nice because it's alliterative and stuff. But I don't like the term peripheral because it makes it sound secondary. And I would argue it's primary, like sense of purpose, mindset, sleep, nutrition. These things have more influence on performance outcomes than reps and sets. Essentially, indisputably, right? They just do. So,
boom. All right. Well, hey, thanks for listening. See you guys next week.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.